Episode 1. Life Sentence. It is the morning of September the 10th, 2022. The second of 10 days of national mourning in the UK. In central London, people flood the streets and squares around Buckingham Palace. In Green Park, there is an endless expanse of flowers, soft toys, and cards. The sky is clear and sunny, but the fresh air of early autumn does not alleviate the dense atmosphere. There are those who cry, those who smile, those who take selfies, and those who remain silent, staring at their emotions with shining eyes. His Majesty's people are experiencing a moment which doesn't feel real. Something personal, but universal. It has united, even if only for an instant, billions of people all over the world. Yes, it's really happened. The Queen is dead. Of course, yes, it had to happen sooner or later. Nobody is immortal. But now that this moment has come to the thousands of people on the streets of London, it seems hard to believe. She was the last constant of that collective experience we call history. But she died, just like an elderly great-grandmother. That is to say, the Queen was human after all. That morning, a few steps from the epicentre of all the commotion, gathered within the walls of St James's Palace, the Privy Council has just concluded the ceremony of accession to the throne. Charles looks exhausted, and his eyes are red. "I shall strive to follow the inspiring example I've been set. I will give my all to follow the example that has been set for me," he says with great composure and dignity in his first speech as king. He now has the task of leading the most prestigious and controversial monarchy in the world. A new king, yes, but also an old man, born and raised in a very different world from today. Since his birth on November 14th, 1948, Charles Philip Arthur George was nicknamed the Prince in Waiting, destined sooner or later to hold the most important office in the United Kingdom. However, no one would have imagined that his nickname would have turned out to be so true, with him becoming the longest-serving heir in history. But that wasn't his first nickname. The first anecdote about Charles's life comes from his late father, Prince Philip, who was absent during his birth because he was busy playing squash with one of his friends. Meanwhile, 22-year-old Elizabeth was struggling with a 30-hour labour, which resulted in a risky caesarean section. It is said that, once informed of the happy news, Philip first allowed himself a relaxing swim in the pool and only later went to Buckingham Palace with a bouquet of roses and carnations for the young mother Elizabeth. At the time, the country was grappling with a harsh post-war period. The wounds of the Blitz were still visible on the streets and in many buildings across London. Butter, flour, and meat were in short supply or rationed. The country was on its knees. Yet that evening, thousands of people thronged outside the gates of Buckingham Palace to celebrate the arrival of the royal baby. However, unlike the fuss among the crowds below, in turning his gaze to the newborn, the Duke of Edinburgh only exclaimed, "He looks like a plum pudding," before going about his business again. And, of course, the little prince would soon have to get used to his father's stinging criticism. In fact, it is no secret that the character of the Duke of Edinburgh, a man who survived the tragic fate that befell the rest of his family, was particularly rough, severe, and often resentful towards an introverted, sensitive, and, in his eyes, too vulnerable child. The young Charles was so different from his sister Princess Anne, who was the complete opposite, sporty, outgoing, and with a strong character. But, unfortunately for her father, she was also the second child. Charles was indeed endowed with a marked intelligence. As the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill noted at the end of a visit to the court when he was only 3 years old. But even with the slightest scolding, the little heir to the throne burst into tears, holed up under the skirts or in the colourful wardrobes of his grandmother, the Queen Mother, or Gan as he called her. More than a Lionheart capable of asserting himself in a difficult world, as his father hoped, Charles showed a tender heart, inclined to matters that went beyond his profound sense of duty, such as music, drawings, and his grandmother's makeup, which he played with during the long absences from his parents' home. Many years later, he would describe her as the best possible grandmother, a refuge of affection in a distant family. If Charles's father was cold, with his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, things would no better. The young Charles hardly got any attention from her, and she was not very physically warm with him. May 1954 is famous. Charles was just 6 years old. Elizabeth had just returned from a tour of the Commonwealth, which lasted 6 months. Her little one ran to her, looking for a hug. "No, not you, my dear," replied his mother, before speaking with the dignitaries sent to welcome her home. The child then had to wait 20 minutes before being able to greet his mother, who, instead of a healthy dose of affection, only gave him a detached handshake in silence. In short, if Charles was misunderstood by his father, he was ignored by his mother. More than just having a stiff upper lip, as they say in the UK, to indicate a person who never lets emotion show. To her son, the young Queen Elizabeth was a mystery. If the Queen had taken half the trouble raising her children as she did with her horses, observed a private secretary a few years ago, the royal family would not be in such an emotional mess. The Queen was an absent mother, both in happy moments such as her birthdays, and in moments of need. One such moment is when 12-year-old Charles was rushed to Great Ormond Street Hospital, where he underwent surgery for an acute appendicitis. The Queen did not get out of bed. When she was around, Elizabeth gave Charles and little Princess Anne a maximum of 15 minutes a day. The rest of the time, to contribute to Charles's training, in addition to the Queen Mother and teachers, there was his great-uncle, or honorary grandfather, Lord Mountbatten, First Earl Mountbatten of Burma, last Viceroy of India, Chief of Fleet and Defence. He was an almost legendary character who had a very strong influence on Charles's life. A difficult childhood was followed by a dysfunctional adolescence. From the age of 8 to 13, Charles attended Cheam School, an institution in southwest London where his father also studied. Charles was by no means the top of his class, but he was diligent and willing to learn. But there was a problem. He had a hard time making friends, and kept very much to himself. For this reason, to strengthen a weak and vulnerable son that was more interested in Leonardo da Vinci than outdoor activities such as swimming and horse riding, the Duke of Edinburgh decided to enrol Charles in boarding school. A glimmer of normality, you might say, but not really. The institution in question is Gordonstoun, which was founded by Kurt Hahn, a German educator who escaped Nazism and was a former mentor of Charles's father Philip. Located in the Scottish Highlands, the school is famous for its Spartan location and considered a place where the children of the British establishment are still sent to this day to learn discipline the hard way. Back in the day, young pupils were forced to take ice-cold showers, run in the snow, and bear corporal punishment. In addition, many nights were spent sleeping in the woods, whipped by the icy north wind. Unlike the young and handsome Prince Philip, who was one of the first pupils to train in the prestigious school and was able to exalt his indomitable spirit and athletic skills as an alpha male, things took a bad turn for the awkward and silent Prince Charles. In addition to its rough methods, Gordonstoun was in fact famous for the culture of hazing that was established among the pupils. Needless to say, the heir to the throne soon became an easy target, both for his role and for his introverted and uncompetitive character. According to the testimonies of some of them, which only arrived much later, in the 5 years spent at Gordonstoun, Charles had to endure all kinds of harassment, often beaten, sometimes harassed, and perpetually mocked. This included being forced to sleep in mud, or worse, covered in urine. Once, he was even stripped naked, locked in a small cage, and left in tears under the jet of an icy shower. It is after these experiences that Charles began to take refuge in books, studying Homer, reading Shakespeare, learning philosophy, and even dabbling in writing small poems. He coped with the difficulties of a harsh environment through his search for truth and beauty. What really happened during those years within the walls of Gordonstoun, no one knows for sure to this day. Years later, there is still a thick blanket of silence among the ex-pupils, now members of the British establishment. One thing is certain. Charles's experience was not an isolated case. In 2015, an investigation into sexual abuse and paedophilia lifted the lid on the treatment suffered by pupils of 160 boarding schools throughout the United Kingdom, including Gordonstoun. Many events dated back to the 1950s, precisely during Charles's years at Gordonstoun. What we do know is that the king, many years later, confessed to a friend, "The things that happened there are unspeakable." Yet in his letters, which were mostly ignored by his parents, Charles limited himself to writing, "Here is real hell." The fact is that, rather than the privilege, for the young Prince Charles, the status of heir to the throne was considered a life sentence. And perhaps it is no coincidence, therefore, that for the end-of-year performance in front of the Queen and his father Philip, who had arrived for the occasion, Charles chose, perhaps in a provocative way, to interpret Shakespeare's Macbeth. Philip didn't take it very well. Evidently disgruntled by the result of 5 years spent in the strict Scottish institution, the Duke of Edinburgh decided to take control and sent his son to Timbertop, Australia, where, willy-nilly, he would complete a pioneering survival course. "Either this will put steel in his veins," Philip seems to have confessed, "or I give up." Other than steel, the boy found himself chopping wood, feeding pigs, pounding snowy trails, and tearing his lungs out on high-altitude runs. For 17-year-old Charles, the months spent in the great Australian outdoors, 15,000 kilometres away from the heavy atmosphere of Gordonstoun, were a sweet escape. So much so that in that short time, the shy, awkward, and often mocked Charles overcame his greatest fear, social phobia. Demonstrating a new sense of savoir-faire, he was perfectly at ease with both Australian locals and rich guests at gala parties. For about 6 months in the lost Australian spaces down under, Charles felt free, perhaps for the first and last time. The illusion did not last long. University would soon begin, a novelty for the English monarchy. For this reason, the choice, as usual, was not up to him nor to his parents, but became instead a matter of state. On December 22nd, 1965, Queen Elizabeth organised a dinner at Buckingham Palace with the sole purpose of deciding which school to send her son to. Among those in attendance were the then Prime Minister Harold Wilson, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and his great-uncle, Lord Mountbatten. In just under an hour, and after hearing all the opinions, the choice was made at a dinner that Charles was not even in attendance at, that he will attend Trinity College, Cambridge. The boy was, at least, granted the benefit of choosing the courses to follow: anthropology and archaeology. This is despite suggestions from dinner party guests who pushed for other subjects which they considered more worthwhile for someone aiming to have a role in the world, such as economics, international politics, or law. But instead, Charles chose subjects that, he said, would have allowed him to govern a multi-ethnic society. It was, at that moment, that everyone sensed that Charles was not going to be a very conventional heir to the throne.